Hey everyone, Drew Hinton with Aero Safety back again to talk about respiratory protection. And so again, in honor of NIOSH's Respiratory Protection Week, we're going to discuss a few more elements of your organization's respiratory protection program. And so in the first video, we discussed how to properly select a respirator, but now we're going to look at the respiratory protection written program. So the policy that's in that old dusty binder that's up on the shelf somewhere that probably nobody's ever seen unless you're in a safety department. And so we're going to look at some of the requirements that's mentioned in OSHA standard 1910-134. We're going to look at some of those specific requirements on what OSHA actually requires. And we're going to look at some things that maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're not familiar with, and help break down some of those specific requirements that are applicable to your facility. And so one of the first things is if you require respirators in the workplace for whatever reason it is, if you're on a hazmat team or if you are just doing it for normal operations, if you have one task or maybe 100 tasks that require a respirator, if you have a required task that requires a respirator, you have to have a written respiratory protection program. Second part here that's not as familiar, that is administered by a suitably trained program administrator. Now, what is a suitably trained program administrator? That's kind of up to interpretation. There's nothing really that comes out and says from OSHA and a letter of interpretation or anything that says this is what qualifies you as a program administrator. Now, sure, there are certification programs out there that you can go sit through an 8-hour class or a 16-hour class or whatever it may be that will train you to be a certified respiratory protection program administrator, or you can kind of go through the standard and kind of self-qualify yourself as long as the facility or organization makes sure you're competent enough to do that task. Now, can you do multiple rows? And what I mean by that is, can an HR person handle the respiratory protection program? Can somebody in purchasing take on additional tasks? It really depends. It's kind of the favorite answer of OSHA's, it depends. And so, are they familiar with respirators, period? Have they ever worn one? Have they ever seen one? Have they ever looked at OSHA's regulations pertaining to respiratory protection? If you've answered no to all those questions, they're probably not a suitably trained respiratory program administrator. But if they've at least know where to go to, what to look at, how to reference the regulations, and can help you out in a decent amount of direction for you, then they can probably meet that criteria. But of course, the more familiar you are with that standard, the more qualified you'll be. And so again, we know that we have a requirement for respirators in the workplace. So I'm now required to have a written respiratory protection program in place that is site specific. So can I have one that's corporate wide? If I work for a company that, an umbrella company that owns, let's say 15 other companies, can I have a corporate wide statement that applies to all locations? Yes, as long as those procedures in that corporate policy cover each of those sites. If it does not cover each site, then you're going to have to make a site-specific procedure, site-specific written program for each location or each establishment. So you can do it, just to make sure that it's applicable to each site and each location. Otherwise, you're going to have to make those individual ones. So we got the program. It's administered by a suitably trained program administrator, and it's site-specific. Now we're looking at there needs to be in the program. And so there were several things listed within OSHA's regulations. So the first thing we'll look at that we discussed in the previous videos is what type of respirator do I have? So how do I select that? And there's a few things that we're going to look at in addition to what we discussed previously as far as how to select that proper respirator. So first off, just as a refresher, I need to know what chemical am I dealing with? Is it a vapor? Is it a dust? What is it? Is it hydrogen sulfide? Is it carbon monoxide? Is it anhydrous ammonia? I need to know what harmful contaminant I'm dealing with, so I know what regulation to look for, what protection levels I need, what type of respirator may protect me or may not, what kind of cartridges, so on and so forth. And so I need to know what type of chemical it is, and also the concentration. So I have to figure out a quantitative data for that. I need to get a meter in there, air monitor, gas meter, whatever you want to call it. I have to figure out some way of determining what my airborne concentration is. Now, one thing that people forget to take into consideration on this part is emergency situations. And so what I mean by that is if I'm normally dealing with, let's say 50 parts per million is my normal concentration of, we're going to say hydrogen sulfide. So I'm working in something that has a lot of decomposing materials. It's producing hydrogen sulfide, H2S. And so I normally have around 50 parts per million. My employees have to wear a respirator all the time. Okay, that's normal. That's normal situations when everything's going proper. That's when everything's running smoothly. What about for emergency situations? What about when my equipment fails or a process fails or something goes wrong to where I have a worst case scenario. I have to take those things into consideration. So what's that worst case scenario? So again, my normal atmosphere concentration, let's say, is 50 parts per million. Now we're going to calculate my worst case scenario. If we look at all the situations, how much can it emit? How much can it produce without ventilation? We're going to say it's 500 parts per million. Now I have to incorporate that into my selection of a respirator. Is my respirator going to protect me up to 500 parts per million, or do I need an escape respirator? And so taking that into consideration as well. Relevant occupational exposure limits. So we're always going to refer to at least OSHA's permissible exposure limit for the chemical if it has one listed. Sometimes they'll have a 8-hour time-weighted average TWA listed. Sometimes they'll have a ceiling limit. Sometimes they won't have anything posted, and they'll refer you to NIOSH's recommended exposure limit or threshold limit values, whatever it may be, from another agency. But I need to know what my limit is so I know what I need to get under. Next thing we're going to do is look at the nature of the work operations. And so whether I'm using one of these, again, half mask air purifying respirators, I'm using an N95, whatever the task may be, if it's 2 hours, 8 hours long, whatever period it may be, what task am I doing? Because what this is going to take into consideration is the physical limitations and the psychological stress it's going to cause by wearing a respirator itself. Is it going to cause issues for the wearer from a medical standpoint? Maybe that person has diminished lung capacity. Maybe that person has a pre-existing medical condition, and I throw this respirator on, and now they're going to have diminished breathing capacity. They're going to have increased CO2 retention. They're going to have all these issues that may cause a harmful effect in the workplace and may cause that person to go down, may cause additional stress and additional medical conditions. And so I need to keep those things in mind as well when I'm making that selection. And so that gets into the medical evaluation process. Is that person medically fit to wear a respirator? In addition to what task they're doing, can they wear the respirator while they're doing that task? And so if they're normally performing the task, and let's say they're at a chemical manufacturer, just because they're probably going to wear respirators all the time. Let's say they're the chemical manufacturer and they are on the operations side of things, and they are going up and down steps all day long. They're carrying bags, they're doing a lot of physical labor, and the person's not in the best of shape. And so normally, without even wearing a respirator, they're putting a lot of stress on the body just from a physical exertion, from walking up and down steps. There are a lot of manual labor of carrying the materials up and down. I'm sure, there could be easier ways. We're not going to get into, what the alternative methods of doing the process. But if there's a lot of physical exertion on that person already, and now I'm going to throw one of these respirators on top of that person, that's going to make their ability to breathe even harder. What am I going to do if that causes an issue? So I need to have that person evaluated by a physician or other licensed healthcare provider. So a PLHCP, that's the acronym you'll see a lot in the OSHA regulations, a PLHCP. And does not have to be a physician. It can be a nurse's assistant. It could be a nurse, PA, whatever it may be. There are a lot of areas to where you can be qualified as a PLHCP for a respiratory protection program as long as you specialize in that area. And if you're unfamiliar, you can reach out. I've done it myself on a few occasions. You can reach out to your local OSHA office and ask them, is this certain qualification in this background? Does this qualify me as a PLHCP for the respiratory protection program? Just because you're qualified as a PLHCP for a respiratory protection program does not mean you're qualified in that same role for something else. So it's all specific to whatever task you're doing, whatever operations you're doing. And so again, you can reach out to OSHA's consultation side. I've done it myself on a few times and asked, do these credentials, does this education, does this background, does this make me, for example, as an EMT, does this make me qualified to perform medical evaluations? Sometimes they'll tell you yes, sometimes they'll tell you no. It depends on whether they're following federal OSHA guidelines or whether they're following your state plans. And so always reach out to somebody and figure out whether it's acceptable or not, because you don't want to be on the backside and figure out, okay, I was performing all these medical evaluations, I'm not qualified to do so. And so looking at the type of work you're doing, the medical evaluations, and so do you have to get away with just simply that OSHA respiratory protection, that medical questionnaire? Can you get away with just that? Do you have to have a pulmonary function test? So pulmonary function test is not specifically required within the OSHA respiratory protection standard. However, depending on where you send the person, that PLHCP may require it as part of their facilities practices. And there's a stipulation in OSHA's regulation that says that is any other procedures and examinations required by the PLHCP. And so even though it does not specifically say under medical evaluations that a PFT, a pulmonary function test, is required, if that facility requires you to do that in order for them to pass you and authorize you to wear a respirator, then you have to do that. And so keep that in mind. It's something you may want to, when you're doing your initial consultation with the medical facilities and figuring out where you want to send somebody for a medical evaluation, that may be something you want to bring up and ask, is there anything else that you want to do? So you'll have to provide them with whatever tasks that your employees are doing. So if they're going to be a bagger, they're bagging the chemicals, putting it in a bag and shipping it out, or if they're just a hazmat team member, whatever task they're doing, you've got to provide that information to your PLHCP so they can make an informed decision based on what tasks they're going to be doing. And so also within the selecting respirators, you got to look at fit testing. Can I perform a fit test on this person? If you're in a rural part of America and it's hard to get a quantitative fit tester, so we're going to say a TSI port account or whatever model you want to use. If it's difficult to get that and you cannot get a quantitative fit test, you might have to consider alternate options. And so, can I do the fit test? What type of fit test is required? But also, is this respirator going to fit everybody? We're going to talk about fit testing in a different episode, a different show here. But this mask is not specifically made for my face. It's not specifically made for your face. It is a generic mask. It is mass produced. It is not specifically going to seal to my face. And so if I'm wearing a tight-fitting respirator, so a tight-fitting respirator is something that requires a full seal around my face. And so this one has to have a full seal around here. If I don't have that full seal, then my protection is going to be sacrificed. And so if I am wearing this and all I have is all mediums, and somebody gets up there and they get small and they get large, it's not going to work. It's not a compliant program because I'm not offering different styles and different models. Sometimes you're going to have to offer MSA and a Miller and a 3M and a Scott or whatever it may be, depending on the type of employees you have and the type of hazards. If you got to offer 3 different manufacturer styles of respirators, then that's what you have to do. But you have to make sure the employees can choose one that is going to fit, it's going to protect them, and it's going to be comfortable for them to not cause an additional issue. And so that's probably one of the biggest things I see as a consultant when I go into organizations is they say, okay, here's your mask. This is what you got. You're going to wear it. Well, I normally wear a large. This is a medium. So just do the best you can. That's not going to cut it. And so you need to get different styles, different models to where they can select the one that fits best, the one that provides protection for them, and that's going to allow them to do their job properly. And so we looked at fit testing. We looked at the proper selection of respirators. We looked briefly at the medical evaluation. So again, having that medical evaluation done by a PLHCP, and those medical evaluations have to be done either before I do a fit test or before my first time using that respirator. And so it can be your first time on the job. If you want to do it first thing when they get hired, okay, you're day one, we're going to send you through a new hire orientation. You're going to be wearing a respirator for your job. So when you get done with your new hire orientation, we're going to send you out to a PLHCP, to the local medical facility, and we're going to have you medically evaluated for a respirator. And so they maybe do the fit test there. And again, something I've ran into in the past is make sure that facility is doing the proper fit test. Just because you tell them, hey, I need a fit test done on this respirator, they may not be as familiar as you think they are with that type of fit test. And so I've ran into situations to where I'm required to do a quantitative fit test. So again, I'm just throwing out the example of a TSI port account. I need a TSI port account, and I'm required to do a quantitative fit test. And I get the results back, and it shows that they did a qualitative fit test with irritant smoke or Bitrac, whatever it may be. That's not going to be even though they're the ones doing it, I'm the one that's out of compliance because I'm supposed to check those things. Now, sure, there's some fault on both parties. But when OSHA comes knocking on the door, it's going to fall back on me as an organization because I didn't do those checks. I didn't explain it to the PLHCP properly to explain what I needed and what type of testing was needed for my employees. And so making sure you have that good communication up front is going to go a long way. So along with the written program, I got procedures for selecting respirators. I got the medical evaluations, the fit testing procedures for tight fitting respirators. So again, tight fitting is ones that require a full seal. Loose fitting on the opposite end is ones that require a partial seal. And so maybe the ones that come to mind for loose fitting, people that are doing abrasive blasting. So if they're doing sandblasting, abrasive blasting outside, they may have a supplied air respirator hood that they're wearing that is a loose fitting respirator. Now, with that being said, even though OSHA does not specifically require it in certain parts, always refer to your manufacturer's recommendations, guidelines. I know specifically with RPB, their manufacturer's guidelines, when you order a loose fitting supplied air respirator for abrasive blasting, it will specifically say that you are required to do a physical examination. They're required to go through a physical before they can wear that. So even though it doesn't necessarily say that in the OSHA regulations, the manufacturer says so, it's got to happen. So make sure you're checking all that fine print and all that information when you get that respirator in. Look through that information. Make sure you're looking at the manufacturer's guidelines. If you have questions, always reach out to them and they'll be glad to answer. So I've looked at properly selecting respirator. I've looked at the medical evaluations, the fit test procedures. Now, procedures for proper use of respirators in routine and emergency situations. So, are they going to use this half-face respirator most of the time? And then if an emergency situation happens, they need to go from, they're going to change the hard hats. They're going to change hats and go from normal operator on one of the process lines. And now they're going to switch over to the internal hazmat response team. So now I go from half mask into maybe a full face APR that provides me a higher level of protection. And so I have to have those roles and responsibilities and those tasks. I have to have those specifically outlined within my written program. And so that way, that if you are a new hire, and this is something great to incorporate into your JSAs and something to incorporate into your job description, is here's where we're going to have to wear this type of PPE. Here's where you're not going to have to wear this type of PPE. And so they need to be fully aware of those situations and understand the requirements of your facility site-specific procedures. So I got proper use of the respirators. And I have to look at also the procedures of scheduling for cleaning, disinfecting. What am I going to do with those respirators once I'm done with it? And so these elastomeric half-face respirators, half-face APRs, full-face, whichever ones you have, if they're the elastomeric style, then Dawn dish soap and warm water is something I recommend. There are manufacturers out there. I know MSA has some specialized disinfectant cleaner that you can have, but there are a lot of different methods. But just get very basic Dawn dish soap is probably the best thing that I can recommend. Get a couple 5-gallon buckets. Get a 5-gallon bucket full of soapy water with the Dawn dish soap and warm water, not scalding hot, just warm water. Have another 5-gallon bucket next to it with filled up with regular water to rinse off the soap. And then if you want to do a third one, if you want to get some kind of disinfectant, you can put that in there to disinfect it. And so making sure your employees are trained on how to take care of the respirator, that goes a long way. You don't want them storing it when they get done with the job. They're working in a chemical manufacturer. They get done with their job. You don't want them storing it on top of a shelf to where, it's going to accumulate dust and accumulate chemicals while they're off shift. And so having a proper place to store that, is that inside of a locker? Is it hanging up inside their locker? Is it inside of a respirator protection bag specifically for your respirator? So understanding those ways to protect this, clean this, disinfect it, and then how to inspect it. So I'll get this respirator. Do I know what to look at? Do I know to look at the exhalation valve and see if I can do a user seal check? Is that part of my inspection process? Do I know to look at the inhalation valves, the flaps? So these flaps can be replaced on the inside here. And so you can replace these valves here, these tan looking valves. They're about, you can get them for around $1.50 to $2 online. You can replace those if they get torn. Or you also have incorporate into that your replacement schedule for your cartridges, your filters. And so there's a few different methods you can use, whether it's based on a calculation based on actual exposures. You're based off of an end of service life indicator. So does my filter cartridge have a end of service life indicator on there to where it lets me know, okay, this has reached its maximum concentration, it's time to replace it. So I have to have that inside my written program as well, as when to inspect it, what the criteria is, and then when to dispose of or get it repaired. And then any other kind of maintenance for respirators inside of that. So if you're using SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus, if you're using SCBAs in the workplace, who's going to perform those repairs on that SCBA? Are they qualified and certified trained technician from MSA or Scott or whoever it may be? Are they authorized to make those repairs? Because if you're buying a brand new set of air packs from let's say MSA, the G1s, you're going to buy several $1,000s worth of SCBAs, and you try to do the in-house repairs yourself, and then come to find out that you just voided the warranty. So there's some management's going to be pretty mad and upset about that. So making sure that we know the procedures for repairing that. Sometimes it's sending it out to a third-party facility to get repaired. Sometimes if I am certified to do the repairs, I'm authorized from the manufacturer to do those repairs. Sometimes I can do minor things in-house and then send the major things out. But I need to have that documented in my written program. So moving on, procedures to ensure adequate air quality and for atmosphere supplied respirators. And so we gave the example earlier with an employee was doing abrasive blasting or sandblasting. And so where is that supplied air coming from? Is it coming from an air compressor that's also used to supply the rest of the facility, all their air hoses and all their air-powered tools, or is it a dedicated air supply source? And so my recommendation is if you're using a supplied air respirator, you better have a dedicated source. And because what that's going to do is it's going to eliminate potential cross-contamination, and also you can add additional features to that. And what I mean by features is you can add a carbon monoxide alarm. So I'm going to give you the example of just because I'm familiar with it, is give the example of RPV. They will tell you have to have a high CO alarm on that air supply system, so that when your oil, if you have unless you have an oilless system, but if you have a system that runs off air compressor oil, if that oil starts heating up, breaking down, it will produce carbon monoxide in that system. And now you're going to be pumping carbon monoxide through that supplied air respirator right into the employee's face. So that's not a good idea there. So you want to make sure that you have procedures in place to maintain that supplied air system. Do you have that carbon monoxide, the high carbon monoxide alarm, and is it working properly? Do you have a high oil temperature alarm? Some of those systems require a alarm that will let you know when the oil temperature gets high, because that's going to increase the CO content as well. And so, is your alarm working? Do you have just an audible alarm? Do you have a flashing beacon that lets your employees know? And then specifically, if you're in a abrasive blasting, that's a loud environment. You're running 100 plus decibels. Depending on the type of setup you have, your noise environment is going to be at least 100 decibels. And so, if it's an audible alarm, can they hear that over the normal operations? So a lot of stipulation can get into that. I'm going to try not to dive in too far into that rabbit hole, but just to ensure that if you have a supplied air respirator system, that system is taken care of, properly maintained, and properly properly put into place to where everybody knows how to operate it and everybody knows what to do in an emergency situation. So I hear that alarm go off, I see the flashing beacon go off. Okay, that means my CO alarms or my CO levels are too high, my carbon monoxide levels are too high. I need to get out. And so having that in your written program and training them on that as well. Which leads us to our next point that has to be in the written program is training your employees on the hazards they're being exposed to. So, okay, you can maybe do a full company-wide training on respiratory protection and talk about all the hazards, or we can break it down. Let's say I want to do a hazmat team. If I have an internal hazmat team at a chemical manufacturer, maybe I'll do one training session for the hazmat team and say, okay, here's all the types of chemicals you can be exposed to. I'll do a separate training session for the baggers and the operators on the lines and say, okay, here's the specific hazard you can be exposed to because this is the general work area you're going to be at. So whereas, the hazmat team, they're going to respond anywhere within the facility, so they can be exposed to every chemical on site. To whereas a person on the line, they're going to be dealing with specific chemicals that are at their particular area. So you can do specific trainings or you can do company-wide trainings, but you have to make sure you're covering all the hazards they can be exposed to, potentially during routine and emergency situations. So again, throwing in that emergency situations concept of, okay, what happens? I know there's all these safety procedures in place to ensure that, let's say anhydrous ammonia levels are contained within this pipe in this process area, but what happens if that system fails? Am I going to continue using this respirator? Am I going to just evacuate and get out of the area and call 911? I got to know those procedures that are in place for that facility. So again, it has to be site specific. Procedures for regularly evaluating the effectiveness of the program. So anytime you change something in the program, you have to retrain your employees on that specific part. Sure, you can train everybody on everything if you want to, but you're just required to train people on the specific parts that have changed. And so if I'm now changing the fit test procedure, so I'm changing respirators, and now I'm going from a qualitative fit test. Let's say I was using irritant smoke before, and now I'm going to change respirators because my hazards changed, my levels increased of the airborne contaminants, and now I'm going to go up to a full face respirator that's going to require a quantitative fit test with a port account. And so I have to train them on the essentials of the fit test, what's going to happen, the different changes that have taken place, and make sure they're familiar with that. But I have to make sure that program is properly working. So at least once a year is my recommendation, at least annually, but more frequently is obviously the better practice there. But at least evaluate to see, are my respirators still protecting my employees? Have my airborne concentrations, whether normal concentrations or emergency situations, have they changed for any reason? And if they have, is it going to change my type of respirator that's needed? Or have my PLHCP, has that changed? Maybe my medical facility that I normally sent people to, maybe they shut down. Do I need to change my medical facility that I'm going to? And now are they going to require additional procedures that are site specific to them? So again, we talked about earlier with a pulmonary function test, maybe the one you've been sending somebody to did not require a PFT, but now they've shut down for whatever reason. They've relocated to where it's not feasible for you to send them to. You've changed your mind, say, okay, we're going to send them to this medical facility, and now they are going to require you to have a PFT. You've got to make those changes in your written program. Another piece of information you put in your written program is where respirators are not required. So this can be something as simple as saying respirators are only required in these areas. All other areas are not required to have respirators. Or you can specifically outline respirators are all required in processing, operations, line 1, line 2. Respirators are not required in the parking lot, in the office areas, so on and so forth. You can get as detailed or as simple as you want, but you have to have in there where they're required and where they are not required. And so making sure those are in your program, making sure you're continuously evaluating how effective your program is going to go a long way. And so whether you're using, again, N95, you're using a air purifying respirator, you're using a self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA, whatever your task is, a hazmat team, you're on an environmental cleanup or environmental remediation team, you're on a chemical manufacturer, whatever task that may be, silica exposure, those all have to be outlined in your program and outlined individually based on the task, how you're going to protect that person. And so again, you can incorporate that into your JSAs, you can incorporate that into your SOPs, your SOGs, your standing operating procedures and guidelines, whatever you want to refer to those as, but you have to have those in place. And now it gets into the question of, okay, this written program is in place for people that are required to wear respirators. What about people that's not required to wear respirators? So what if they just want to wear it because, even though we've done our sampling, our atmospheric sampling, we've come up here, we show them, here's your readings, here's the permissible exposure limit is, we're going to say the permissible exposure limit is 10 parts per million. We are at 4 parts per million. You're safe. You do not require a respirator. And they still come back and say, I don't feel safe. I don't think it's safe to be breathing this stuff in. I want to wear one anyways. Can you allow them to do that? Yes, you can, but with stipulations. And so you're going to explain to them, yes, you can wear this as long as it's approved by us, the facility, the organization, the company. So the employer has to approve it to make sure that it's not going to cause an issue. And you also have to explain any kind of issues that it may cause and say, okay, you're taking this on at your own risk, but it may cause psychological effects. It may cause issues with, again, the carbon dioxide retention, the CO2 retention from breathing out, breathing it back in. It may cause issues with increased respirations and cause more labored respirations. So you have to explain those things and also allow them to look at the respiratory protection standards. So you can either print it off, hang it up on the bulletin board. You can print it off and give them a copy, or at the very bare minimum say, okay, if you want a copy of this respiratory protection standard, come see me, I'll print one off, or here's the standard 1910-134, you can go look it up. But as a best practice, you're always going to want to at least either post one up on the bulletin board to where everybody can access it, put in the binders where everybody can access it, or provide a copy to them. Because if OSHA comes in and says, did you explain the potential hazard to this person, even though they're voluntarily wearing this respirator, it's going to be difficult to say, well, I told them they can go to 1910-134. It's going to be difficult to prove that. So if you have it posted on the board where everybody can access that makes it a little bit easier to prove your compliance and prove you are honoring your due diligence and making your best effort for the employee. And so again, Going over written respiratory protection. So kind of to summarize everything, if you're required to have respirators, it's got to have, your company and your establishment has to have a site-specific written respiratory protection program that is administered by a suitably trained program administrator. Does not necessarily have to be certified, but they have to be suitably trained to know what they're administering, the requirements of it, at least how to reference the requirements. And so looking at written programs in place, administered by a suitably trained program administrator, and then train everybody on the requirements of that program and review it, as needed. So again, I'll make the recommendation of at least annually. More frequently is a best practice, but anytime there are changes in your system, go from a 3M to an MSA respirator, you're going to want to review that, update your policy as needed, and then make that training available to your employees. And so again, if you want to reach out to me, I'll put the website at the bottom of the screen here, www.aerosafetyus.com. If you have questions about your written program, you have questions about fit testing procedures, you have questions about selecting the proper type of respirator, feel free to reach out, and we'll be glad to have you. Again, thanks for viewing. Have a great day.